Welcome back, everyone. So lovely that you've joined us again today, and things are even more exciting this week 34 of 2023, and we are back with That Was the Week That Was. And this week we have two very controversial men in the media spotlight. But before we talk about that, please join me in welcoming Vince McLeod of the Alternative Centre. Hi Vince, how are you doing?
G'day Bob, and g'day Internet. I'm doing very well. I think we've had the most interesting week so far this year, so I'm very interested to talk about it.
Well, let's just jump into this week. The long-anticipated assassination of Yevgeny Prigozhin occurred, and his fall from grace was immortalized in images of his plane falling from the sky. Putin has signed a decree requiring all mercenaries to swear allegiance to Russia. How do you read this situation, Vince?
To my mind, I think Prigozhin was lucky to live as long as he did. The saying that if you come at the king, you better not miss. That's never more true than it is true of Vladimir Putin. Prigozhin, in my opinion, he signed his own death warrant the moment that he turned back from the march on Moscow and elected to agree to Vladimir Putin's terms to be kept out of the limelight for a while. I think that as soon as he said that he was going to let Putin stay in power in the Kremlin and was not going to try and overthrow him with the Wagner mercenaries, as soon as he turned back, he was a dead man. So I think what has happened is not really surprising. I think actually most of us predicted it as soon as he turned back from the coup attempt. We were all just surprised at how long it took. I wasn't at all surprised to hear that Prigozhin was assassinated because he was traveling with his top lieutenants. I think it was very foolish on his part and of the part of his aide-de-camp to all travel on the same helicopter. It's bound to be that the Russians would shoot them down. And I think the Russians probably knew about it long ago because you saw so much cell phone footage of the plane going down from so many different angles. It was obvious that many people knew that it was about to happen. So, yeah, I think that's just what we all expected, really.
Well, the article makes the point that the Russian state media have not covered the crash extensively, instead focusing on Putin's remarks to the BRICS summit in Johannesburg and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So from some points of view, it's just another Russian assassination, isn't it?
What it brings to mind for me is what the Romans and what the Soviets called our damnatio memoriae, which is somebody they dislike so much that they basically strike them from the record, the historical record, and act as if they never existed. They don't mention them again, and they take down all mention to them in stones and historical records and so on. So I think that's going to happen to Prigozhin. They're just going to pretend he never existed, and they're just going to move on. That's how cold-blooded things are in Vladimir Putin's Russia.
Wow. Well, Trump's up next. His mugshot for his fourth arrest has sent ripples around the internet, and the memes are traveling at the speed of thought. Trump has been booked and released, but he has not yet been arraigned on his 13 criminal counts of the Georgia election interference case. What is happening in this saga now, Vince?
It's hard to know exactly what's happening for the simple reason that we don't know to what extent that this is just a witch hunt. We don't know for certain that the prosecutors have any justifiable reason to be arresting Trump and to be arraigning him, and we don't know that it's just not another case of political persecution. It is unprecedented for a former American president to be arrested and to be dragged through the court system for questioning election results like this. In my opinion, he hasn't actually interfered in election results at any point, and this is a total witch hunt. But it remains to be seen if the people in the American court system who are going to be overseeing the trial think the same way. So we're just going to have to wait and see, and wait for the American political establishment to put more of its cards on the table before we can really guess as to what's going to happen to Trump.
Well, there are predictions that there will not be an election in 2024, and they're gaining in quantity and volume. Do you think that it's more likely that Trump will pull out of the running for the 2024 election, or that the election will be called off altogether?
It's possible that Trump will pull out of the running, but what I think has to be borne in mind is that candidates have actually run for the presidency from prison before. Lyndon LaRouche did it in 1992, and another candidate did it in 1920. So it wouldn't actually be the first time an American candidate had run for presidency from prison if it did happen. But I don't think it will. I don't think he's going to pull out, and I very much don't think that the election will be called off. If you look at American history, they haven't had an election called off since the 18th century, which is longer than anybody else in the history of the world. If you look at the American Civil War, for example, 1861 to 1865, they had the 1864 American presidential election in the middle of that, uninterrupted. So not even the Civil War could stop them from having an election. And I don't think this business with Trump is going to stop them as well. If it did, it would be the biggest thing to happen in our lifetimes. It would be bigger than the collapse of the Soviet Union. It would send ripples around the entire world if the Americans would hold off on one of the elections.
Oh, we live in interesting times.
Yeah, for sure.
In New Zealand last week, it was reported that our government is now expected to borrow $35 billion more than was planned 8 months ago. ACT's David Seymour was quoted as saying, "At the core, New Zealand's problem is low productivity, too much government waste, too much red tape and regulation, which means too much compliance time and not enough productive time." Is this the root of the problem?
Seymour is partially correct, but to a large extent he would make the situation worse by importing a lot of low-skilled, cheap labour, which is really the main reason for our productivity problem. New Zealand's been importing low-productivity, cheap labour ever since the 1950s. Back then we didn't have a productivity problem. Back in the 1950s we were up with Switzerland and America and Australia as the wealthiest country on earth. So it was really since then, since we started importing cheap labour, low-skilled cheap labour, that we started to have a productivity problem. ACT wouldn't actually help that because they'd like to open the borders even further. They'd like to make us more like the Philippines. So I think although they have a point in that there is too much red tape, I don't believe they've got the solutions to the problem.
This is the typical environment in which New Zealand voters turn towards National in an endeavour to find someone to fix the financial burdens that Labour have usually exacerbated. And the polls are indicating that people are indeed turning to the right. But will life get any better under a national government?
The main thing that has to be kept in here is that the entire Western world is going through increasing economic difficulties. And it's not really a matter of New Zealand taking a centre-left path or a centre-right path. We're just a small ship on an ocean of very large waves. And these very large waves are coming from places like the US Federal Reserve. And in reality, New Zealand can only react to these decisions that are made overseas. So I don't think life will get any better under National. I think the Western world, and to some extent the world at large, is headed on an unpleasant trajectory. And if people think that voting National is going to turn around New Zealand's fortunes completely and we're going to go back to how it was 20 years ago, then I think they're very much mistaken.
Well, let's move to sport. A little bit of relief. South Africa produced an incredible display at Twickenham and set themselves up for the Rugby World Cup with a 35-7 thrashing of New Zealand. Where were the All Blacks with their discipline and magnificent passing? What did you think of the game, Vince?
Well, it was certainly one of the worst All Blacks performances that I've ever seen. South Africa was also extremely good. Thought they had a fair bit of luck with the bounce of the ball and with the calls of the ref, but they were by far the better team. That's actually the biggest loss that the All Blacks have ever suffered in 120 years, which is obviously not ideal preparation going into a World Cup, but that's how it is. I think that we've also got a bunch of players who were not actually available. Brady Retallick, for example, Shannon Frizzell to a lesser extent, and Cody Taylor. I think if they'd been there, the forward pack would have been stronger, and we wouldn't have been strangled to the extent that we were. But still, it's an extremely worrying loss, and I think it's another example of poor coaching under Ian Foster. Everything is going to change when it comes to the actual World Cup, of course. But if we meet South Africa again in the quarterfinals, which is very possible, then I think that South Africa is going to be the favourites by some margin.
Because this does set the Bokke up for a win in France, doesn't it?
I think they're the favourites now, because if you look at the results of the other warm-up games, France and Ireland, they've had wins, but they've been reasonably close, whereas the Springboks here have got the all-time record win over the All Blacks. So I think based on the warm-up games, Springboks will look like the favourites to win their fourth World Cup here in France.
So, Vince, I was 5 when the Americans landed on the moon, and it was one of the most exciting days of my life to this day. This year, the Japanese and the Russians both crashed on the moon, but last week the Indians became the 4th country in the world to successfully touch down on the lunar surface. It's getting pretty crowded up there, isn't it?
It's getting crowded now. I think it's because recent advances in computing technology over the last 20 years have made it a lot easier to create craft that can go up there and have a look around. It's interesting that the Japanese and Russian crafts both crashed on the lunar surface, and that the Indians managed to succeed. It seems like a lot of the major powers in the world are battling for second place behind America right now, behind NASA and what the Americans have achieved in space. So I think a lot of the others are going to try and replicate it now. We've seen China also put lunar modules up, and the European Space Agency has plans to do similar things. So we've got America, China, Russia, Europe, India, and potentially even North Korea could come into the game. So there's a lot of people contesting for lunar space right now. It's like something out of a science fiction novel.
So cool. Well, we've come to the end of our show for today, so thank you everyone for joining us. All the articles that will be included in the description. Please remember to like and subscribe so that you never miss a show. And Vince, what a week that was.
Yeah, cheers, Bob. Cheers, Internet. I think that was the most interesting week we've had so far this year, especially with the Prigozhin assassination. I think that could have consequences. So stay tuned for next week.
The alt centre are clown world's good guys. They don't fit into boxes neatly enough to be someone else's tools.